Ready? Welcome to the San Carlos Planning Commission meeting, November 19th. I'll call it to order, and please rise and join me in the Pledge to Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. May we have a roll call?
Commissioner Roof?
Present.
Commissioner Iacopone?
Present.
Commissioner Dugan?
Here.
Vice Chair Bergman? And Chair Bradley.
Here. Thank you. Listen to the public comment section. Public comment is limited to items not on the agenda. The Planning Commission may briefly respond to statements made or questions posed as allowed by the Brown Act. However, the Commission's general policy is to refer items to the staff for their attention or have a matter placed on a future Planning Commission agenda for a more comprehensive report. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes of our last meeting, November 5th. Any comments? Do I hear a motion?
I motion to accept the minutes from the last Planning Commission meeting as stated.
I'll second. And we'll vote.
Commissioner Roof?
Yes.
Commissioner Iacopone?
Yes.
Commissioner Dugan?
Yes.
Vice Chair Bergman?
Yes.
And Chair Bradley.
Yes. Thank you. This is a study session of the Planning Commission, our second one. Study session on retail establishments selling ammunition and/or firearms as defined in the San Carlos City Municipal Code, Section 9.24.010. And we have a staff presentation by Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Quickly, just to refresh your memory for the audience, back in 2017, the city received a request from Turner Outdoorsman to open a firearm retail establishment in San Carlos. And due to concern from community members, in November of 2017, the City Council adopted a moratorium on retail establishments selling ammunition or firearms while the city studies options for some regulations. The moratorium is effective through May of next year. Staff conducted 2 community engagement meetings, and the Planning Commission conducted a study session on November 5th and requested additional information on a model ordinance to regulate new firearm retail establishments. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is your second study session to hear from the community, consider options from staff and legal counsel on regulating retail establishments selling firearms or ammunition. We also have the police chief here tonight that will give a brief presentation and be available to answer your questions. And then we're hoping you can provide staff with some direction to assist us in the preparation of regulations. Okay, so the city regulates new businesses as either 2 different categories. We either consider them permitted or conditional. So permitted is it would be allowed at that location with a simple business registration. Conditional means it would require approval at a public hearing, and that would be by the Planning Commission. And the city can impose reasonable conditions on the business operations. Firearm retail stores are currently considered permitted uses and allowed anywhere a retail store is allowed in San Carlos. As I indicated, we have a moratorium in place at this time that holds any new firearm stores while this topic is being studied further. In your packet, and we have extra copies for the public, is the Giffords Law Center has prepared a model land use permit ordinance, as well as the law enforcement permit and a Second Amendment analysis. So that was included in your packet for your review. We also did a little bit of research on other jurisdictions regulating the sale of firearms and ammunition. So Sunnyvale requires retailers to submit ammunition sales to the police chief. San Francisco requires a license from the police department, and they also restrict ultra-compact firearm sales. Sacramento requires a use permit, as well as a license requirement issued by the police chief. Alameda County, a use permit, and there they've specified a 500-foot separation requirement from residential schools, other firearm businesses, and liquor stores. And they also require the firearm dealer permit be issued by the county. Oakland prohibits sale of certain guns determined as junk guns and compact handguns. Los Angeles also requires retailers to submit ammunition sales to the police department and prohibits sales of ammunition clips larger than a certain size. So we've tried to narrow down the focus for you this evening. Last meeting, we gave you a breadth of information, and tonight we're trying to help focus that discussion down a little bit. So some items for the commission to discuss are locational requirements. Do you want to require that any new retail establishment selling firearms or ammunition have a distance requirement from schools or residential uses? What are the appropriate zoning districts for these new businesses to locate in? If you choose to have a use permit, what would those findings be for the granting of a use permit, and what submittal requirements would you like to see? Are there any other operational requirements you would like to impose in an ordinance? And then also continue the discussion of do we want to require a discretionary law enforcement permit? So the first topic on the locational requirements, the code currently prohibits the selling of firearms from residential properties. So that is not an area that we need to address in the code update. The city can establish, as I indicated, a distance from sensitive land uses for new firearms establishment. The commission can consider imposing these requirements. The model ordinance that's in your packet suggests a distance between 250 and 1,000 feet. And then you should also consider what list of sensitive uses, if you're going to have that separation requirement, what uses do you want it to be separated from? The model ordinance suggests schools, preschool, daycare, parks, community center, place of worship, youth center, and residentially zoned areas. We had our GIS consultant prepare 2 maps so you can see the range and what properties that would remain. So this first map shows a 600 feet separation requirement from residentially zoned properties, and that includes properties in San Carlos, Belmont, as well as Redwood City. The result is 265 properties in San Carlos. Now, note I indicated properties, so there are many more tenant spaces and opportunities to locate. Those are just, since this is a property-based system, that's how we need to do the searches. So this would also include sites that are zoned industrial, airport, as well as general commercial. Some of those zoning districts do not currently permit retail sales. Many industrial areas do not. I don't believe the airport does. So that's something to consider is, do you just want to have locational requirements, or do you want to have locational and zoning district requirements? It would narrow it down even further if you did. And then the next map is the 1,000-foot distance from residentially zoned properties, again, both in Belmont, San Carlos, and Redwood City. And we've just combined it so you can see the comparison. So the light blue and the green one combined, you're really looking at that 600-foot separation map, and then the green only is the 1,000 feet. All right, so the next topic on the use permit then. Staff does recommend, we marked up the model ordinance for your packet, so you saw some notations on that. And we recommending using the city standard use permit findings that you're familiar with, but the commission could impose additional findings. We do have some instances in the code where you're required to make the standard findings, and then there's a couple of additional findings that are appropriate for that use. Also discussed, do you want, if we're to require the law enforcement permit, do you want that to be issued prior to the Planning Commission considering the use permit, or could it run concurrently or thereafter? The model ordinance suggests that the use permit could be approved first, but subject to the approval of the law enforcement permit. any other submittal requirements or operational requirements that we'd like to add into the requirements. And then I'd like to pause for the police chief to talk a little bit about security and safety.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome, Chief.
Good evening, everyone. As far as law enforcement is concerned and this city is concerned, our issue with gun stores is really paramount as far as security. More of the contemporary gun stores now that are opening today, they have web-based video systems, ones that have a kind of a cloud-based server that records everything. They usually keep it up to 2 months, so we can go back and check any type of, in case there's any kind of investigation. And a lot of the contemporary gun stores now have security gates. So when someone comes up to the gate, to the front, they have to look at the gate to buzz them to allow them to come in. So that's really an important feature these days. So not everyone can walk in and out of the stores like before. So it's not like your retail store. They can look to, so if they can see any kind of threat or anything that doesn't look right, then they won't let them in. Of course, that's a burden on the owner, but it really works best. I've seen that in another gun store here in the county. It works very well. And really the biggest safety factor I see is gun owners now are removing every gun from the shelf. What's the biggest fear? The biggest fear isn't really any kind of attack on the gun store really during the day. It's really at night when it's either burglarized or like we had an issue here in San Carlos where the gun store was, they ran the front with the vehicle and went in and started taking guns off the shelf, is where gun owners remove every gun off the shelf and put it in a safe. I mean, before they can break in and try to compromise the safes, the alarms will go off, that state-of-the-art video system will be there. And I mean a video system that's mobile, a video system that can read serial numbers off dollar bills, someone that we can really fine-tune. We've used that in our jail systems before. They're very successful for our use of force policies, so we're very familiar with things like that, with that kind of video system and retention. And but if there's really nothing to take in these gun stores, because most of the gun stores now, as far as their ammunition, they have them behind cages, so those are locked at night. So really when there's a burglar at night in a gun store where you have a good video system and you have everything locked in a safe, the only thing they can really take is really gun cleaning equipment, maybe some scopes, but nothing really that can really harm the public. So I think when you really think of planning on having a gun store in town and really redoing the ordinance, those are really the factors you really have to look at. And you can put bollards in the front as well, so it takes any kind of vehicle ramming or compromising the front of the building. Those are really the things that I think you should really consider as far as updating the ordinance. Securing the guns at night where they can't be easily retrieved, making sure that the ammunition is safeguarded behind a cage, and any kind of video system and alarm system.
Chief, do you happen to know, were firearms stolen in that incident? And if so, about how many? Do you happen to know that?
That was before I was chief here, but I don't know how many, but guns were stolen, yes.
Chief, first, thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate your perspective. Do you think about ammunition different from guns? In other words, the opportunity to have a gun store with no ammunition, or does it not matter in your mind? How do you think about that?
Rephrase the question one more time.
So we apparently have the opportunity to consider whether a gun store might be selling guns but not have ammunition as well. Do you think that makes a difference in the long run, having a gun store with guns but no ammunition? Would that create any improved safety opportunity?
No, because I think if the gun owner, if the ordinance is written or recrafted to where the guns are secured and the ammunition are secured, it's kind of like when you go to Home Depot and you can't get to the spray paints or things like that. If it's secured and they have a good process in place, that they both can coexist in the same manner.
Great, thank you.
You mentioned putting the guns in a safe as a protective measure. in your experience, I mean, you guys respond really, really quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I know that's what happened in this last incident. Do you think that you can get there in time before a safe is compromised?
Very much so.
Okay.
Most of those safes, most of the high-quality gun safes, you would have to get either a grinder or a torch or an explosive to open those up. So, and most of them are fireproof, so it would take a long time. And if the video system, which is paramount as well, I mean, all these safety factors are used together. I mean, we can identify the suspects and safeguard everything until we get there. With the safes and everything they're doing, number one, the perpetrators will look inside the store and go, well, it's really not worth my time, and they'll just move on. I mean, that's our goal here. But if they do make the overt act to compromise the building and go inside, then it'll buy us a lot of time to get there.
Okay, thank you.
Chief, could you explain your perspective on the impact of the store's location on the security of the guns?
The store's location, say, we like to have a store like in an area where it's easily accessible, where there's good lighting. We don't want like a gun store like in an offbeat industrial area, anything like that, to where it's open to the public and it's easy access for us. And that's really about it. Away from schools.
That's interesting because the 600 or 1,000-foot rule distance from residences tends to leave only the more offbeat areas left for a location. So I'm wondering if that's an interesting observation. Yeah, I can imagine if a gun store is off in an area where nobody's around, then it makes it that much more vulnerable. Well, if it's on El Camino, then there's some safety.
I'm going back my experience with residential burglaries. A lot of times the burglaries that we discover right away. I mean, when the deputies go in service in the morning, the first thing they do is start hitting Laurel Street, looking for broken windows and hitting all the areas in the morning as soon as they go in service. And if it's an offbeat area, I mean, if it was a gun store anywhere, we go and we check that, one of the first places we checked. But it's easier identifiable if it's in like say like El Camino where cars are driving by, and if there's some suspicious activity, someone could report it right away, and then we could be dispatched to it. If it's in an offbeat area, you just wouldn't have that extra layer or that extra component.
Chief, in addition to land use or zoning restrictions, we're also considering perhaps a recommendation on a law enforcement permit. We have an example of that here. Have you had a chance to look over that, and do you have any opinion on, is that a burden for your department? Is that something you guys would embrace? Do you have a perspective on that?
We do not have, the Sheriff's Office does not have a program in place to do that. We've never done that before. We leave all of those backgrounding, all the permitting to the Department of Justice in the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and explosives. They do a phenomenal job of backgrounding, checking, and we work in conjunction with them.
So in your perspective, it would be redundant for the sheriff to be involved in that capacity?
Any backgrounding or anything like that, yes.
Okay.
And that is actually the industry standard for law enforcement.
Okay.
Well, now I'm a little confused because the model legislation provided by the Giffords Center does include various discretionary law enforcement permit provisions, but you're suggesting that those are already covered under a separate jurisdiction?
Yeah, Department of Justice, which is regulated by the state of California, and federally by the alcohol, tobacco, and explosives.
And Chief, that makes sense with regard to background checks, but some of the items here, and this is a study session, so we could even go through some of this, but operational aspects of the business, so actually would involve law enforcement inspection to verify the safe, to verify the security, things that perhaps the building department or the planning department might not be as equipped or as experienced to involve itself in. And
No, that can be done, absolutely. I was just referring more to the background checks and the federally mandated things or different provisions. That's what DOJ does and the ATF&E.
Got it. So law enforcement permit, mostly around the inspection of the site and its security operations, that would be something you'd potentially
Something our organization could do, yes.
Okay.
We could develop a form and do yearly inspections or whatever you would decide.
Okay.
Because from what we received in the study packet, it sounds like DOJ and AFT don't always get enough time or have enough resources to fulfill their obligation and authority. I found it pretty alarming, but and also the fact that there were court cases asking that you had a warrant to enter and inspect, and that would take unnecessary time, and I don't think we want to get into that.
So the provisions that you mentioned as being as most valuable for security, where would those provisions be enforced from, or whose jurisdiction would those be? The web-based security, removing the guns from the shelf, Ballards, all those ideas. I don't understand where in the law that requirement for those things would lie.
Where in the law, as far as the law of the state of California?
Well,
or the recommendations
how can
from the commission?
Where's it written down that to be non-expert on this? Where's it written down that there needs to be a security gate that's used to buzz people in?
Oh, I don't know if it's written down. Only thing I know, that's what I've seen that kind of the newer gun stores are implementing, and they're having a lot of success.
Through the chair, in the Giffords Law Center Model Ordinance, Section 6, which is on your packet, page 37, has many of the on-site security issues that the chief was talking about, and including securing the weapons after hours and video surveillance system, and all those things are subject to approval by the chief of police. I'm looking for the part about the on-site security, but those are certainly things that can be included in an ordinance. I mean, site security such as bollards and other, bars on the windows, things of that nature that we think would enhance the security. That's open to you to include that in an ordinance.
So this would need to be included in the San Carlos ordinance, then.
Right.
In the model on packet page 39, it does talk about video images, and maybe there's some input from the chief if we were to adopt language like this that would enhance it and make sure that it's current with the most current technology that you'd be familiar with and think would do the best job of providing security. So we could certainly work to bring those ideas into this kind of language here.
Certainly, we need cameras that would be enhanceable enough to where we can do facial recognition. We utilize facial recognition software. We've been very successful with that in various crimes that we've investigated recently. So different things like that to where they're high-resolution cameras.
Very good.
Have you known of anyone to require any off-site storage of images for any given amount of time? I mean, everyone's like really happy with the cloud, but I'm in high tech, and some days the cloud's not there.
Sure.
So I'm just there are places that do require off-sites, I guess, or we could make that a requirement.
You can do off-site. You can do both.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. We like it to where the server isn't there.
Yeah.
That offsite is fine. It's just the reason I say cloud-based because then that's away from the facility that we're talking about. So even if it's offsite, that's fine.
Okay.
Chief, I heard you about being less interested in gun stores being in remote or more dark industrial areas. As you think about the commercial districts of San Carlos, and I think of it as kind of El Camino or Laurel Street, or maybe a little bit on San Carlos Avenue. Are there any of those areas that you're more or less supportive of if we were to put a limitation on the location?
No, I don't really have an opinion one way or the other. I don't know if a gun street would really fit on Laurel Street based on kind of the businesses that are there, but El Camino, San Carlos Avenue, those are all well-traveled areas. So I think all gun stores would be safe and successful in those areas.
Thank you.
How long do you recommend images to be stored? I mean, how long would you possibly need to keep them when would you use them, or when would you not need them?
I know based on how we do in our like, and I do in the police department here and in our custodial facilities, we do it up to a year, but most businesses are doing it up to 2 months.
Okay.
I think 2 months is a good thing to go back and take a look. I mean, there's certain businesses that are on a 24-hour loop, so if you don't catch it in the 24 hours, that's really not enough. I'd say about a 60-day window where you keep that, and then it falls off or gets eliminated.
Okay, thank you.
Chief, in terms of frequency of reinspection or inspection, do you think annually is enough, or differently, would it be a burden? Given that we don't have many, and I'm not sure about my colleagues, but we're not thinking of having many. Do you think twice every 6 months would be a burden to have a formal drop-in visit inspection and approval that the conditions are being met? Or if you had your preference, what would you say? Just annually?
I recommend annually, but biannually would not be a burden. Okay. If that's what the commission decided, that would be doable for us.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter to you how many gun shops we have in the city?
No.
Back to the locational issue, could you explain why you would rather not see a gun shop near a school or near a place that serves alcohol?
I just think that it's easier not to have it near a school. I mean, public perception and kids leaving school, especially like a high school, you don't want them hanging out in front of a gun store. And usually schools and areas like that are more closer to residential areas. And I think it's better to have gun stores in more of a commercial area.
And the alcohol establishments?
Usually alcohol establishments are usually open after a gun store is closed.
Yes.
So I really don't see an issue with having an alcohol establishment within a certain amount of feet.
As we're considering some of these regulations, perhaps, I'm aware Imbert and Smithers has been in business a long time, and they did have that break-in. So I think I would be supportive of bollards or whatever would secure that better being applied to them. But as I'm familiar, I think there's a number of things they don't do now. Like I don't think they secure their guns in safes at night. I don't know the condition of their security cameras. Given their long track record, would you recommend we grandfather them in any way, or should everything we come up with apply to them as well?
I think we should really look at I think we should really is this on, or can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but it
We
went
can
off.
hear you. Can you hear back there? Good.
Can you hear me back there? I'm usually pretty loud. So.
Yeah.
That's never
I
happened.
think we them and keeping their store safer. There we go, we're back on. Yeah, so I think it should be there should be considerations based on how they run their system. I know that they're very in Burton Smith. They're very law enforcement friendly. They call. I can give you an example. They did call us one time when there was a suspicious person in there, and we were able to download his photograph off their high resolution cameras. And with that being said, we were able to get the gentleman's ID. And he had since been released from prison, was a felon. And with that, we were able to write a search warrant and find out who he is. And we arrested him for being in there and violating his parole. So he was arrested for doing that. And that was because of Burton Smithers calling us and being proactive. So I think they would be open to any suggestions we would have.
Have there been any instances with that store? I know it's been here for like 5 decades or so.
Or so. No, not at all. Besides that one break-in and that one instance where they called us proactively. That's really been it.
Thank you very much for being here, Chief. And I wanted to ask if you had any ideas that, as a Planning Commission, we would like to make recommendations based on your expertise and familiarity with the process and the community.
Are you asking me if I would like to make recommendations, or?
Yes, if you feel comfortable doing that now.
I do. I go back to what I originally was stated. I really think that we can really utilize technology in safeguarding these gun stores with the cameras and the state-of-the-art alarm systems, and really just buying time and securing the facilities with, safeguarding the ammunition and really locking all the guns in safes at night. And not only will that deter crime and deter people wanting to break in there for the number one reason to gain access to these weapons, but it just buys us time to get there in time and do that. And it gives us all the tools to allow us not only to buy time, like I indicated, but investigate any chronic crime that happened. That's what we use the technology for. That's really, I think, the basis of success for this kind of thing.
I have one other question. A couple of cities that we just went over in the introduction have exclusions on the type of weapons that they will sell. It looks like Oakland has one, LA or something that basically prohibits on sales of junk guns, restriction on sale of ultra-compact firearms. Do you have any opinion on if there's something that we should prohibit as far as types of guns?
I don't really have an opinion on that. My opinion is really on security. Okay. I mean, as long as the guns are legal in California and have just the magazine capacity within the legal limits, then I'm good with any weapon that they want to sell, as long as it's within the law.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Would it be appropriate now to have comments from the audience?
I was going to close the presentation if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
So just to remind the commission, then, the conditional use permit process we talked about, that would fall under your purview and something that you would make decisions on and make a recommendation on. The law enforcement permit would fall into a separate section of the code, so not in the zoning section of the code, but in our health and safety section. And that is something that would be adopted by City Council. They certainly want your input and recommendation on it, though. And then something then that would be reviewed by the police chief. It's also the health and safety with the discretionary law enforcement permit could apply to the existing businesses, and the city attorney and our legal counsel can probably expand on that more, but you could also have kind of a phased-in approach where maybe it applies after a period of years. So like the police chief said, they could work with them to kind of upgrade some of those items unless it's already in place now. So those are several options. They would not, existing businesses though, would not need to obtain a conditional use permit. So that would only be for the new businesses.
Question on that. Thank you for explaining. That explains why the discretionary law enforcement permit material was not in the excerpted
Correct.
Portion,
Yes.
which was baffling me there for a while. But to some extent, how they're located, which is our purview, I see as part of a bundle with how the safety is implemented. I mean, and I wouldn't want to consider one without understanding the other, really. So
Yeah, and I think that's
be comfortable saying it's okay, you know, where it's located, it would depend on what kind of safety provisions go
Yeah,
with
and
it.
that's the reason staff was recommending that the discretionary law enforcement permit be issued prior to the Planning Commission considering the use permit application. So staff was recommending it in that separate order, so you would have all that information available for you in order to make the decision on the use permit.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then we talked about the discretionary law enforcement permit. Your last meeting, we can answer any additional questions you have on that. And then the staff recommendation is just to provide some direction so that we can prepare a formal ordinance. And then just as far as next steps, the City Council is scheduled to conduct a study session to review your recommendation. So that's an additional step that we've placed in there. And then after the City Council study session, then it would come back to the Planning Commission for formal consider of the ordinance, recommending it up to City Council. And then City Council ultimately would decide on the ordinance.
Has the city council set the date on that?
Do you have the date set? It's definitely early next year.
So we have time, we could
City
continue.
Council is going to first have its own study session in January, and I'm not sure which meeting it is. I think it's the second meeting in January.
That sounds right.
And then the Planning Commission will see a draft ordinance, I think in February.
February.
And then the idea is, because the moratorium expires in May, that we need to have the new ordinance in place and adopted and effective by that date.
Thank you.
Can answer questions, or we can also respond to questions after public comment if you wish.
I want to reiterate or re-question, make sure I understand what's already been stated. Smith, I always get their name mixed up, but it's Smith and Ebert, right? Smithers and Ebert. Anyway, they're on El Camino, way up toward the end of the map, right? Were there, and that seems like a good location for a gun store. They just sort of fit in there really quietly and do their business. But to the chief's point, I mean, the places that would be allowed are pretty much in the industrial areas. So it seems like we have a conflict in what we have as our zoning and what's best practice. So I guess, do we have it within our purview to create different zones or overlays or anything along those lines that would allow us to, I say, put the gun stores, if we allow any more, in a better area? Is that possible?
Yes, we could establish some type of locational requirements. We'll need to have some parameters for those.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Locational parameters sounds important. I'm not, and I get what you're saying about the logic, how to have a sort of a systematic approach that where that could be done. It seems challenging. I mean, that may be something that the staff could bring to us. If it's hard, we send it back to the staff to do the real work, I guess. But because I'm not sure that given the chief's input and looking at these maps, 600,000 foot distance from residents, that it's really putting the hypothetical additional gun store in a good location. I guess this is maybe more of our deliberation rather than a question, but.
Yeah, I guess my point is I'd like to stay within best practices somehow.
Yes.
And I'm not quite sure how to do that. Maybe that is for discussion. We can discuss that more. Yeah.
That's discussion.
Yep.
I had a question. So this Giffords report includes a summary of 155 California cities, towns, and counties, and determined some cities did this, some counties did that, but it made me ask, are there any existing county regulations here that we need to make sure we're in line with?
San Mateo County regulations?
Yes, yeah,
No, we're not aware of any.
okay. And with this summary of other jurisdiction regulations on the sale, are any of these under challenge, or are these relatively settled law at this point?
You just come up.
Welcome, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm not aware of any of the ones that are cited in the chart that's in the packet that are currently under challenge.
Okay.
I know some of them have been challenged in the past. For example, San Francisco's had several challenges. Sunnyvale has as well, but not from a zoning perspective. That was its ban on the possession of high-capacity magazines.
Okay, thank you.
While you're here, would you like to add anything at this point?
I don't have any affirmative comments prepared, but I came in order to answer any questions that members of the commission might have as you deliberate this evening. So I'm here and happy to answer any questions.
We appreciate you're here. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So actually, I do have a question while we've got you,
Commissioner Ruth.
which is which other jurisdictions have implemented these land use limitations before us? So who else would we be?
Sacramento has, and the County of Alameda has, and it was the County of Alameda's regulations that were upheld by an en banc panel of the Ninth Circuit.
That's reassuring.
Maybe just one follow-up from last study session. I'm not sure that I got it right. Is it within the city's ability to limit the number of retail gun locations to a number or less?
There's no authority that says that you can't, but if you did so, you'd be in uncharted waters. What Sacramento has done and what the County of Alameda has done and what the model ordinance prepared by the Giffords Law Center contemplates is that you regulate location as you traditionally do by zoning and distancing requirements. And we know that you're in safe territory doing that because the Ninth Circuit has upheld the County of Alameda's ordinance. There's no authority out there that says you can't limit the number to a particular number, but that's really an untested legal approach.
Good, thank you. And then on a related, I believe, I'm interested in change of control from one business owner to another. Granted, we only have two. However, if there were a change of control from, generation to generation or one owner to another, is there anything that we might be bound by or limited by in terms of if we were to set up a grandfathering for existing locations, could that expire upon change of control?
Greg, did you want to?
Well, on the zoning and land use items, the use permit, conditional use permits are run with the land, and it is transferable to a new owner or a change in control of a business entity. The health and safety law enforcement permit, because it's an annual permit, that would be reviewed on a change of control.
You'd have to have a new applicant. I would think you'd have to go through the same process, assuming they wanted to have new employees. They would all have to go through background checks.
So in a situation where one of our two existing locations were to sell, and provided that the applicant and staff met whatever it was, the background application, background check requirements, they would be completely entitled to remain in the location that they're in now. And if we were to come up with another area that we liked gun stores in better, we couldn't tell them to relocate.
Well,
That's correct from a land use perspective, and on the law enforcement permit, that's just a permit to operate the business and satisfy the security and other requirements. So they could definitely stay at the same location. There is a way, you might have noticed in the Gifford model ordinance, to try and amortize a business. That's not something that we're recommending.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Another question about the distancing.
Yes.
You might not want a cluster of gun stores all in a row. Could you have a distance parameter from another gun store?
There's nothing that says you can't. I think that would be within the purview and the discretion of the Planning Commission.
Along those lines, to your knowledge, would we be on safe legal ground if we were to prohibit certain types of weapons, automatic weapons, AK-15s, military M16s, and extended magazines, so forth?
That's an open question. There would be an argument that California law already really occupies that legal terrain. There's the Unsafe Handguns Act, and there are also many regulations of assault weapons and rifles that are already written into California law. And so if the city were to adopt similar regulations that overlapped with that, or that in any way were at odds with state law, then there would be an argument that you had, those regulations were preempted. So we're not recommending that the city go into regulating the particular types of firearms that can be sold, because California law is fairly prolific on that already.
Thank you.
One last from me for the moment, and that is, has there been any jurisdiction where the city town has instituted requirements, a really long list, and either an existing or an applicant for a retail gun store have objected, sued, and won because the city went over the top and really just wanted to make it so difficult, so expensive, so painful as to keep any new business selling retail guns out? Or again, is that, is the list of things that we're looking at deemed reasonable if most of them were put in and, hey, that's the rule, you got to deal with it, go if you want to be a gun retailer?
As far as the list of items that are in your packet tonight, I'm not aware that there's any case where a subset or the entire list of items in your packet has been adopted and has been overturned by a court. There are situations where local governments have imposed, for example, a ban on the sale of firearms altogether, which the California courts have invalidated as being preempted by California law, or have imposed requirements on the acquisition of weapons from sort of the purchaser side, and good cause to obtain a concealed carry permit, where some courts have said you've basically made it impossible for anyone to get a concealed carry permit, and so that may be a violation of the Second Amendment. But short of sort of the more drastic regulations like that, I'm not aware that a court has invalidated any of the types of regulations that you're looking at this evening from a land use perspective and a public safety perspective.
I'm not sure I understood what you said. Could you repeat whether or not we're in legal shaky ground to basically to prohibit any more, grandfathering whoever's here, but prohibiting any more gun stores? Is that legal, or did you say that?
It's really untested, Vice Chair Bergman. I'm not really aware of a jurisdiction that's approached the land use regulation from the perspective of regulating the number and drawing a line on 2 or 3 or 4. The approach that has been upheld by the courts is sort of the zoning approach, that you can't be located within a certain distance of whatever the land use body, the Planning Commission, the City Council deem to be sensitive uses, whether it be a school or a place where children gather, or places of worship, or a liquor store, things of that nature.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. All right, it's time for public comment. First, if anyone would like to speak, we ask that you fill out one of these slips from the back table and turn it in to any one of us. First, the only one I have so far, Marie Reardon. Oh, Reardon, sorry. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. My name's Maria Reardon. I'm a resident of San Carlos. I understand that this is a volunteer role for all of you and that 3 of you are relatively new to this position. So you may not have had time to review the recordings from the 2017 council meetings that led to the gun moratorium or the community meetings regarding firearm regulation back in May. Today was the latest shooter incident at a hospital in Chicago. As we have moved through 2018, we have watched with horror and sadness a number of mass shootings. Parkland, Florida in February, Santa Fe, Texas in May, Pittsburgh in October, Thousand Oaks earlier this month. Nowhere is safe. Hospitals, schools, grocery stores, places of worship, places for fun. And yet we continue band-aiding this uniquely American public health crisis. What doesn't make it even into the news are that there are over 12,000 people who have died from gun violence and over 24,000 additional people who have been injured by guns. These are only numbers for 2018. And yet we have not reached a tipping point for improved national gun safety. As you complete this zoning exercise and make your recommendations to the council, I implore you to remember these gun violence numbers. Please also consider the inevitable escalated costs to San Carlos Police, Fire, and the nearby hospitals from senseless gun violence. The tax dollars brought in from these kind of retailers cannot begin to cover or compensate for human costs or the city costs. I prepared my notes, but I wanted to make a comment on something that was discussed about the safety of all this technology. Well, I worked in Silicon Valley. I worked in software. Technology can fail. I personally do not feel comfortable or want to be dependent on these companies to make me feel safe. It gives me very little comfort that there's going to be recordings that can be simply erased in 60 days and 90 days from now we have a shooting. It is easy to turn away from all these tragedies or become numb to the alarming gun violence numbers. But it is certainly harder to take a leadership position and possibly an unpopular position. But please do all you can to restrict additional gun stores in San Carlos. I'm asking you to recommend the strictest zoning possible to restrict firearms from being sold in San Carlos. I understand we do not live in a bubble, and gun violence will continue with close to 400 million civilian-owned guns in the U.S. But decreasing senseless gun violence must start at a very local level. Please make San Carlos a very undesirable place for firearm retailers, and yet a very desirable and safer place for its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Well put. We have a couple others coming up. Next, I have Ms. Peter Tisvat. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Peter.
Chair Bradley, you weren't the first, but believe me. Actually, I had a couple of questions for the chief since he's here, and if he could elaborate on them. In the history, you can hear me, I guess, right? So in the history of crime, what does the correlation between the distance between a residence or a school have to do with the location of a gun store? The other thing I wanted to ask, since somebody else brought up the question of injury, life, and property damage, with all of the liquor establishments in San Carlos, what is the cost to injury, property damage, and to life because of apparently San Carlos can't say no to anybody who sells booze? And that's what I'd like to find out from the chief, if he's available for comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
What was your first question? Correlation between distance of gun stores to schools.
So what's your question, the correlation, if there's any statistical information?
Is crime or insults and injury to children spike because of their distance to schools?
No, I don't know. I don't have any of that information if it spikes, but we don't want to increase curiosity.
Okay.
So that's really it. I don't have any of that kind of statistical information you're looking for. And the next one is, what do all liquor establishment cost us in injury and property damage? I don't have that information. You mean like drunk driving accidents, or I don't have what it would cost. We don't do that. That would be a private owner, an insurance company, or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And next in line is Gina Rolski Felix, is it? Okay. I apologize. Thank you and welcome.
It's a challenging name. Hi, I'm Gina. I'm the owner of Imburton Smithers, and I appreciate the invitation to come to this meeting. After a robbery a few years ago, aside from being beside myself, we upgraded all of our security. And after we upgraded our security system, we also upgraded our bars. We have a very sensitive system. We've had some false alarms because it's so sensitive, as a matter of fact. So I feel confident the security system that we currently have is pretty good. We did look into Ballards at one point. The way the sidewalk angles, I worry about the Ballards. There's just a kind of a steep slope, and I worry about people who are either in wheelchairs or in other challenging accessibility. So I'm not sure if that would be the best bet. But with the security that we have put in, we quadrupled the size of our bars, and I could try to do some other things. I'm happy to work with the city, but we're doing what we can to be as safe as we can. I don't know if the buzz-in electric fence would be as conducive. We already stopped selling the black guns. We've focused on more of a hunting and handguns for people. I think that would scare the people who are just kind of dipping their toe into the water, if you might. It's nerve-wracking to get into a gun store if you're not too familiar with them. It's a terrible society we're in right now as far as the mass shootings. But with California state law the way it is, we're so restricted. You have no idea what's coming up. There's ammunition regulations. People can't have ammunition shipped to their homes anymore, so it has to be shipped to the shop. People are going to have additional licensing next year in order to be able to purchase ammunition as well. So with all these new regulations, I feel that we're on a good path right now for making people as regulated as you can possibly do it, especially with Gavin Newsom now in office. I'm a little nervous what he's going to do. But in addition to that, back in the early 2000s, San Carlos tried to implement the trigger lock ordinance. Well, the state one-upped them the next year, and they put one into effect. Back in the 90s, there was actually a Saturday night special law put into effect, so we weren't able to sell junk guns. So we're San Carlos is actually more compliant than you can even realize if you've looked at some of the past laws that you have put into effect or your predecessors have put into effect. So we're working with you, and we're happy to serve the public. Thank you for your time, and I hope to speak to you guys later.
If you wouldn't mind, yeah.
Absolutely.
When you upgraded your security, did you have a consultant advise you on that? Was it just things that occurred to you, or can you just take me through how you thought through that process?
What we did was one of our customers actually put in the additional videos with our video cameras, and we also moved the cameras so we had a better eyesight. When the robbers came into our shop, they actually wore hoodies, so we couldn't actually see their faces anyway. But it didn't matter which perspective because of the way they were shading themselves. So we moved the cameras, we added some cameras outside, so we talked to law enforcement, and we were working with our security camera guy. I could actually pull up my security on my iPad if you're interested. So I have access to it 24/7.
And how long is that preserved on the cloud?
I think it's about a month. So I could talk to my my security guy and see if he can add an extra month. But it's, for the time being, I mean, a month has been fine. We haven't had to utilize it past then. Most of the times that we have to deal with law enforcement, it's within a couple days.
So it sounds like you upgraded the bar security over the windows.
Absolutely.
And a better camera system. Are your guns still left out at night, or are they secured?
They are left out, but we also have motion sensors, heat sensors, and we have lots of sensors in the store. I've gotten multiple calls in the middle of the night where a bug flies through, and they're like, "Are you sure? Do you want somebody to come out?" We actually, many years ago, this is kind of a funny story, there was a moth that was flying through the heat sensor, and they called out the SWAT team. So it's one of those things that was so sensitive. I mean, we dialed back a little bit. But
Fair enough. And do you recall how many firearms were stolen in that incident?
26.
26, okay. And were any of those of the semi-automatic variety?
There only one.
Okay.
And the rest were handguns.
Okay.
But it's hard for us, too. I mean, we're a small business. When you have that substantial of a loss, it doesn't make us feel good either. That's why I updated all the security.
Sure.
It terrified me. I got the call at 5:10 in the morning, and they said, I parked around the back. I had no idea how bad the front looked. It was horrible. It's hard to relive that. I don't know if anybody's ever felt a robbery at their homes. My parents had a robbery at their homes, and I felt the same way. You feel so violated, and you just want to protect yourself and your business. And that's how I felt when my shop got robbed. Doesn't matter what's stolen from you. It's somebody coming in that's not supposed to be there.
You mentioned that you're appealing more to hunting, sporting weapons now. Do you sell automatic weapons in the store?
Semi-automatic handguns. No, none of the black guns. We've totally gotten out of that market.
So pistols, not rifles?
Just pistols. Mm-hmm. There are some semi-automatic hunting rifles, to be more specific, but the AR-15 style guns, the way Californians have, or California legislation has changed them, it's not worth me carrying them.
Glad to hear that. I'm an Air Force retired officer, and I fired M16s, and there's no, to my knowledge, and I don't know much about guns, they wouldn't be hunting things. They're for mass murders of human beings.
From your perspective, I see that, sir, but there are people who do target shoot with them. It took me a long time to come to grips with that as well. But yes, I have stopped carrying those particular weapons. And yes, there are a lot of bad people who do bad things. Unfortunately, they don't follow the laws.
Thank you very much.
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank you.
Yeah, and certainly we appreciate the chief's endorsement that you've been responsible in your current operation. Thank you.
Next speaker lined up, Danielle La Amperzell. I can't read it. Danielle, is that right?
Hi, Danielle La Campagna.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. I'm a resident of San Carlos, and I've been very active in this process for the last, gosh, it's been about a year and a half. So you probably looked at old tapes and seen that a lot of the residents were just very concerned when the gun store Turner's was going to open, and it seemed pretty apparent that there were no regulations. So happy to be at this meeting where you're discussing this in such detail. So I'm actually a social worker, so I work with people with mental health issues, and my issue is more with suicide risk and guns. Not to say that mass shootings is not incredibly important as well, but it's what drives me to kind of look at this issue. I'm actually happen to be a gun owner, and I took my safety test at Imbert and Smithers because I inherited, for lack of a better term, some weapons. So I'm familiar also with Imbert and Smithers on that respect. So I'm glad to be talking about more of a multi-pronged approach to the new gun dealers and stores that come in. I do think the zoning and the issue around schools and children is one that should be definitely looked at. I think I really appreciated staff's report and outlining the areas that were left. I certainly understand that Imbert and Smithers is a functioning business already that's taken a lot of time to look at security, and they're in a different situation where they are, and they're here already in that area, but it seems like the areas that were looked at here seemed reasonable. I do like the idea of the law enforcement permit, even if it is a little bit redundant. I trust our chief here and the police that are in our area that know the regulations and are following this issue closely. I like the idea of the use permit. I think that's what would tick off the public hearings and notice procedures, possibly. So that, I think, was where we were blindsided as residents. That could be very helpful. I like the prevention ideas that were talked about, the bars on the windows, securing the guns, the ballards, having some sort of a gate. I think, just as jewelry stores would do that, I think those kind of things should be looked at and considered. And then should something horrific happen, the idea that there's a camera and the security features that Gina spoke to seem really prudent, and some gun store owners might not think to do that themselves. I really appreciated Chief Dury and what he said about the very encouraging incident that their store had, that they called him and addressed that right away in real time. That's very important, but we can't trust that everyone's going to have a 50-year relationship and a good standing with our police department. So I think having those regulations would be really important. And just to reiterate, bring it back to the suicide component is what's important to me. Our coroner's office in San Mateo County found in 2017 there were 55 suicides in our county, and 17 were by firearm. In 2016 there were 68 suicides, and 25 were by firearm. Homicides here have been much reduced from those numbers. Not to say that, again, a mass shooting could change that statistic completely. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, and appreciate your thoughtful consideration on all of these issues.
Thank you so much. And next is Debbie Blucher.
Hello, my name is Debbie Blucher. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a resident of San Carlos. I have 3 young children, and I haven't personally touched by gun violence. A friend of mine from high school was shot and killed at work in San Francisco. He's a UPS driver at his place of business about a couple years ago, and Mike Lafiti. And it's just, no city is immune to this. My aunt and uncle live in the town next to Parkland, Florida. That's one of the safest communities they've ever seen, and they have lived all over the U.S. And things like tragedies like this can happen anywhere. So I feel like we're almost living in a bubble here in San Carlos. It's very safe. I've always felt very, very lucky to be here, to send my kids to these great schools. But there's not a day that goes by that I don't worry about their safety at school. So we already have a gun store in town, well established, and I just don't see why we need to bring more of that element into town and more of just more guns into our city. So there's plenty of places people can buy guns outside the city, and I just don't see why San Carlos has to have another one, especially with the way that our federal regulations have a lot of loopholes, and it just seems that these mass shootings are just becoming so commonplace that they hardly make the paper. I mean, the one that just recently happened, I think it was in at the dance club, I think it was in the paper for like 2 days, and then like no one's heard anything else of it. If that had happened 5-10 years ago, we would have all been at memorials all over the place. So it just scares me that in the coming months and years, I mean, this could be a daily thing. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks.
Thank you for speaking. I have one more. Richard Pierce. Hello.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Pierce. I'm also the attorney for Imbert and Smithers. I just have a couple of comments I'd like to make. First, I want to compliment everybody, including all the speakers. Just about every what I consider legitimate point for and against has been addressed. And I think there's been a real effort at fairness here. One comment I have is the draft proposal mentions removal of all firearms and secured at night. From a practical perspective, that can be pretty difficult. Handguns, one thing. You can park a lot of those in a safe. The long guns are a little different. If you want to put them in a secure or something, you're talking about either multiple safes or a very major investment of money for that. You noticed of the guns that were stolen at the Imbert incident, most of them were, all but one were handguns. I don't think Gina would have any objection to that. That's not that hard. But if you have to take all the long guns out, take them out at night, put them back in the morning, that's a real expenditure of time. And for those of you who've been in the shop before, a lot of those guns, they're not only a firearm, they're a work of art. And the kind of thing, they have to be handled pretty carefully. Now, should we do something about that? I think so. I think, as somebody mentioned, that there's such sensitive alarms now, they can be secured to where they are standing, where they are placed by those, the wires and whatnot that can go through there. That can be very hard to be cut in a matter of minutes or seconds. And as the chief said, they can be there very quickly. One point that hasn't been brought out, as we know, Imbert and Smithers does not sell military-style weapons now. They don't sell the black guns. But they they cater to hunters, to sport shooters, and also collectors. In that regard, Imbert and Smithers is kind of the last of a dying breed. I collect World War II paraphernalia, and I have a collection of rifles. The kind of things that you don't get seen in a robbery or a crime or a mass shooting, probably because a lot of the ammunition's hard to get, but it's just not the kind of thing people are going to use for that. So they do serve a purpose for a lot of legitimate folks there. I've been doing it for years. I know, as the chief said, there's an awful lot of peace officers who use Imbert. Firearms concerns, their tools of the trade are unfortunately their handguns. And they all come to Imbert for that because it provides that service. But other than that, we look forward. If you have any other questions, please let us know.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else wishing to speak? Even though you haven't turned in a slip, you're welcome to come up, say a few words, and we'll continue discussion.
I have a question for staff. A conditional use permit triggers a public hearing, is what I heard. But what's the notification area?
That would be 300 feet.
So my feeling is, I don't know if that really accomplishes what the community at least would want it to accomplish. Because I think think gun safety is a little bit different than whether someone has a window looking into your living room. So I don't know if it's worth discussing that if we discuss any kind of conditional use permit that we put a different kind of notification requirement on it to where more people are notified. That's just an idea. I'm not saying we have to do it, but it's something to consider.
Do you want to close the public comment and open the?
Since it's just a study session, you don't need to do that. But you've heard everybody that's here tonight, and you're free to discuss it right now.
Yes, Shannon, I like that idea. I think the implications of approving a new store are citywide, and so we would want. It'd be nice if we found a way to mandate a much broader notification if that were to happen.
Just a comment on the notification. It's 300 foot, as Lisa Porras indicated. Also required to be published in the newspaper. But I don't know, a lot of people look at the legal notices. But another option could be that they have to post a notice in the window of the place of business so that anybody driving by at least would see it. So that could be something that could be added.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just going to put if it were Shannon's world, what Shannon would do. I mean, I don't expect that to happen, but I'm a vet and I'm a gun owner, but I also am really, really strong on gun safety. I would love it if we kept Ebert and Smithers here forever, right? But I frankly don't. And I think there's one other gun store in town. I really don't want to let anyone else in, and I don't think it's necessary to have a lot of gun shops. And I'm also very concerned about like where this one that tried to come here, where it was, because it is an area where it's commercial, but there are a lot of children's uses there, and I don't know how we protect against that. But if I were to have my druthers, I would grandfather Ebert and Smithers in, but not let anyone else in. But I don't know if that's realistic, and I don't know how everyone else feels. But obviously, we can work on it together. But I just wanted to put that out there.
From my perspective, that was kind of behind thinking about could we limit the number, and I guess the feedback I heard was you can, but come at it another way, meaning set your conditions set the bar high enough so that anyone else coming in really has to step way high and think twice about whether they would want to come into this city to open a retail gun location. I mean, my bias would be we've had a great relationship, or a good relationship between the city and our business owners. They're working to do the right thing, and let's not penalize them, but also let's not make it easy for anyone else. So I guess maybe we can't do that by limiting the number, so we have to pick these other options.
Yeah, that's what I heard. That's untested legal ground. That's what I heard. It's untested legal ground, so it's not illegal, but we are in new territory, and I don't know how council feels about being in untested legal ground.
Well, since it's a study session, there'll be another opportunity after the city council looks at this to come up with whether or not that's something that the council wants to look at. So.
I have to say back to you, David, the chief's comments about where a better place for a retail gun location would be was counterintuitive from maybe the conversation we were having the other evening. And I think it does give a little pause to, I'd be interested in other commission members, what your reactions were about actually keeping them front and center and keeping them in the public retail districts as opposed to in the industrial retail districts.
Yeah, I learned two things. I think one is you don't want them to be offbeat, and now I understand the word offbeat actually means the police officers beat. Never knew that. Never thought of that one before. But you don't want them to be offbeat, but also raised by the police chief and one of our citizens who spoke was the curiosity factor. And so you also might not want to have the shop be really prominent. The hunters, people who are invested in the sport, are going to find the establishment. So it's not necessary I wouldn't think, or it wouldn't be as important from a business perspective. So the sweet spot may be on beat, but not prominent, where it could entice somebody who wouldn't have gone there otherwise.
Yeah, I was thinking of signage. We hadn't discussed signage. That didn't come up, but that might be one way we could.
Yes.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very appealing from so many ways to have a big neon sign, guns here, but. Yeah, I mean, there
was a case because of our gun on sign,
mm-hmm.
The Tracy law. We did win the censored sign, or we did win the fact that we could have a gun on our sign again. That kind of grew attached to the censored sign. So
Yeah.
But we did win that.
Yeah, I think the staff already prepared a few areas that it would be more difficult to go than others, and I'd like to see fewer gun stores. I'd like to have the ordinance be robust and stable, not something that could be struck down easily because we're overreaching. So there's I'm looking for a sweet spot where where we can justify the regulations from a strong safety perspective without having it be the claim. Maybe even a valid one, that no, you're just making, those are rules that de facto ban gun sales, and that's thinner ice to be on, and then we could all be in a lot of trouble if somebody got that struck down.
I had a question for Greg, please, and that is, the way I was reading the material in the Gifford Law Center brief, the requirements for background checks, let's say, apply to applicants and employees. It doesn't actually, or I didn't understand if it applied to the backers of applicants. You know, in some ways, the person who is the front for a new business would not be a person I'd be concerned about as much as the person who was the controlling interest, who was the money behind. So can we extend our obligations to the investors in or the controlling shareholders of a new business and beyond the applicant themselves for new businesses coming in? Any idea?
Well, I'm just looking at the security issue, and then let me see the permit background check.
Page 37.
Yeah, I was on definitions on page 32, and it talked about applicant, and then it was going through, you know, who the applicant was. But
personally, I heard Chief talking about how, you know, the background checks are really the purview of the existing regimes, and not something we'd want to be duplicating. I think, as I understand kind of the law enforcement use permit, it would be more verifying that the state mandated or federally mandated checks have been made, and that would, you know, I think it's I don't know. Are we wanting to establish additional background checks than currently exist?
You know, my familiarity is with having, through a business, applied for and holder of liquor permits. And actually, it's not just, call it the leader or executive, it is the legal entity that controls the business has to comply as well. So I guess the point being, a condition for maintaining a permit was not only the applicant, but If there was an investor who violated law, was a convicted felon, et cetera, they would actually be cause for rejection of the application. So I was just trying to understand if it was, you could extend the net a little bit.
Well, we'll have to look into that because it raises a lot of issues in my mind about, we might actually have an applicant who's a publicly traded corporation, and we might have an applicant that has multiple shareholders. A subchapter S corporation, which is still considered a small business, can have up to 35 shareholders. So I'd like to look into that to see if there's a connection between ownership and the city's interest in maintaining security and background checks for the people handling the firearms. And I might note that section 2 of the packet, page 33 of your packet, provides that it's unlawful for any person, corporation, partnership, or other entity to engage in the business of selling without getting the permit. So the entity itself will have to get the permit, and the employees of the entity will need to pass the background checks, because a corporation isn't going to be able to pass. I mean, there's no background check for a corporation. But I see your point. We should maybe look into whether shareholders of a corporation that owns such a business might be subject to that.
Thank you.
I have another question about conditional use permits. With the conditional use permit, does the Planning Commission still have to stay within certain findings, or can they just decide that for whatever reason that they don't want that business and deny the permit? So do we still have to like maintain within certain scope or findings?
Well, a use permit is a discretionary approval, so you don't, the city doesn't have to approve an application, but there are standard and legislatively imposed findings that you need to make so that your decision is based upon substantial evidence and is not arbitrary and capricious. So an evidentiary finding is going to be required in most cases, probably all cases really, on these types of discretionary permits, but the law provides that any one of them is valid. So you don't have to have a whole bunch of findings to deny. You just have to not be able to make one of the findings, and that has to be based on substantial evidence again.
Do we decide the findings then? So we back to...
No, they're in our they're already in the ordinance. Compatibility, detrimental to other land uses in the area. There's I think 4 main ones, and there's other ones that you can add. As long as they're contained in the legislation, you can add some other findings in order to approve one of these businesses. But I think it's just the case law and the land use law, well established, is in order to approve a business with a use permit, you need to be able to make the findings based upon substantial evidence in the record. If you're denying a business, you have to point to some fact why you can't make the findings that are required to approve the business.
Is that, like, for instance, I know that on the commission here, we've had disagreements on whether road signs are detrimental or not, right? Some people say yes, some people say no. That's sort of a judgment call of the commissioner, but that would be an example where...
Yeah, I think you're talking about billboards, and yeah, if there might be something about that particular property where the billboard is located, just hypothetically here, that you could say, I can't make the finding of compatibility. I mean, that's within your discretion. I just like to see a clear record of why. The answer to that question, why, based upon something in the record, but that's a case-by-case basis what you would be looking at.
Thank you.
I understand why we might be on shaky legal ground if we did permit certain types of long guns and automatic weapons. military type, so forth. But there are several things that have come up in my reading and at the meeting here tonight that I'd like to make sure that does get added. It was mentioned in one place at least, add places of worship to the list, like schools and preschools and maybe liquor stores, maybe not, because there have been records recently of lots of hate crimes where somebody goes into a church or a synagogue and kills a lot of people with an automatic weapon. I'd like to see also domestic violence convicted people added to the list of other crimes that shouldn't be permitted to buy weapons if possible. Another thing that troubled me was, how about 18-year-olds? Why do we need to have 18-year-olds going in gun shops? Now, I did read there are sporting goods stores that also sell guns, so don't they have a right to go and buy running shoes or something? But if they're in the same, in a multi-use store that's selling these kinds of weapons, I don't think 18-year-olds have any place there, with or without parents or guardians. But we might be going too far with that.
I think some of those areas are already in the state legislation. I think the state changed some weapons. You have to be 21 now, and perhaps it's all of them. I'm not sure.
The only exception is an 18-year-old can buy ammunition if they have a properly issued California hunting license.
Okay.
I believe that's
I think next year.
Okay, so there was a lot passed, but it's not fully implemented yet. And then there are some of the things you discussed, Commissioner Bradley, I think are also either partially or wholly contained in state law. But we'll make sure that, I think one of our purposes here is to make sure that we are recognizing all the areas that have been preempted by state law, and we don't want our local ordinance to try and attempt to regulate that, because if we have one word that's different, we will be considered preempted. So what we like to do is when we issue the permit or the whether it's a use permit or the police permit, the law enforcement permit, that we have a condition of approval. Because these are discretionary permits, we can have a condition of approval that says you'll comply with all state laws. And so that's a valid condition on a local permit, and all we're doing is making sure that the state law, it gives us the ability to if there is a state law violation, to revoke the permit. So it puts the onus on the permittee to make sure they comply with the state law, and it gives us a tool for enforcement.
Understood. Thank you, Greg.
I guess I would just hope maybe, I kind of view there's, two, I don't know if they're threshold issues, but probably the two most important things for us to really think through, and maybe we could focus on them for just a bit if you, the other commissioners agree. And I think first is the number in town. I mean, I think that is something we should discuss. I did review some of the previous hearings the town has had, and I mean, I think it is a pretty loud and clear, 2 is enough for San Carlos. And if you think about us as a city of 30,000, 2 is certainly a contribution to the gun market in the Bay Area. So I think that's an issue. And then secondly, where we'd want it to be allowed in town, whether we want to think about radiuses from different sensitive uses, or if we want to think about specific zoning. I tend to think, certainly heard Chief saying a more public area makes sense. And I think El Camino actually is not a bad place for these sorts of establishments, a busy avenue that is frequented but is not, particularly sensitive, or, teenagers hanging out, that sort of thing. So anyway, I don't know if we want to take one at a time, but it seemed to me that getting those two things thoroughly discussed would make sense here up front.
Trouble with El Camino is that all along that street is pretty close to residences, so you'd have to throw out the distance from a residence criteria, and we'd have to come up with some other systematic tool to define El Camino as being okay. I mean, unless we just can take our highlighter out and say we like this and we don't like that, and
well, I mean,
a definition, have it be based on a
I think we can make it. If we make an overlay, could we make an overlay? I mean, I think, like I said, I think El Camino is probably the best place. I certainly don't want Laurel.
Yeah.
But is there a way that if something's close to that residence, or that we could, close to the residential, or, well, I guess we can change the, how many feet away from residence to get to the same end?
I don't particularly know if I support radiuses from things, just because it ends up drawing such a strange narrow box somewhere that we might not even want it to be. So I support more of an overlay or being more prescriptive. I'm staring at our zoning map now. I mean, we have a downtown core and a mixed-use downtown already defined, and I think, those are the principal Laurel, San Carlos areas that we would not want to see it. And then based on Chief's opinion that it should be a commercial district and not an industrial district, I think we get pretty close to what we're thinking about if we just think about a commercial district that's not a downtown core or downtown. That would push it to El Camino, away from the downtown core, where Smithers and Imberts is at. It would potentially include some of the southern portion of Laurel. So if we didn't like that, then I think we would have to come up with a new district or some kind of overlay.
Well, I might be kind of stepping out of city attorney here, but there are other shopping areas in town that there are retail uses that are not particularly remote, that are not on El Camino. I mean, you should really think about where on the map we have similar uses to that, along industrial, for instance. So.
Yeah.
So how can we make progress on this? Is this a...
Well, I think we need to provide guidance to staff, right?
Right.
We need to do, is the goal, well, one, do we need another study session, or two, can we give enough guidance to staff that we can discuss it and make and vote on it next time? I'm inclined to believe we probably need one more.
Well, just remember, January 14th, the City Council is going to be having their own study session. We have 3 new council members who this issue is probably familiar to them, but they haven't had the opportunity to review it as you've done the last 2 meetings. And that was intentional. We wanted to get your input as the Planning Commission, so the City Council would have that information at the time of their study session, and then we're going to try and all put it together for you in a zoning ordinance and health and safety ordinance after that. So you're going to have a few more opportunities to take a look at this, but any kind of feedback, and we're getting valuable feedback of kind of the geographic areas you're thinking might be appropriate, that would help, because that'll end up in the report to the City Council, and then the City Council will provide some additional direction.
Yeah, I think, and I would echo the point that, industrial, El Camino, and maybe some of the corridors, Britton, Howard, if there were a retail gun establishment in there, they're relatively well-traveled day and night. You can clearly see Britton is, because it's a 101 access. So maybe those would be places to consider as corridors that would be acceptable. And then, can I just check? I think one of the asks that we have before us is, how do we feel about moving it out of permitted and into conditional? Is that, we haven't really talked about that, but it seems there's a lot of energy around making a conditional use permit. So is that true, fellow commissioners?
Just for me, I think it should. That's one of the things one thing that we should do definitely is have a conditional.
Yeah, I support that.
Well, one point of clarification from the staff, would that be redundant with the land use permit? Do we need a conditional use permit?
No,
after the...
it's two separate permits. So one would be issued by the police chief at a staff level, and the other would require the public hearing. So we should maintain it as two separate.
I thought the police, that was a discretionary
Right,
law enforcement permit,
Correct.
separate from a land use permit.
Exactly, yes,
Yeah.
you're correct.
Thank you.
So would we be able to see the conditional use, the law enforcement provisions at the time that we're recommending the land use provisions? Because I'd like to see them before recommending an ordinance regarding land use. I'd like to understand what law enforcement provisions are going hand in hand with that.
I agree.
And it seems like it's also going to be true vice versa, but I mean, so you kind of want to bring them together in parallel.
And that's the reason we're having you look, even though legally the Planning Commission does not have to look at the law enforcement permit parts of the ordinance, we thought they were relevant to each other, and you'd want to look at both. And then procedurally, I think the way any use permit would come to you at a public hearing would be somebody has already applied for the permit and received that permit, but it's not effective until the land use is...
That's the second totally separate thing, and I also like that. But as far as the locational requirements, the idea that there should be a minimum distance between gun stores so as not to create a destination or a higher concentration, that seems more. And it's exactly, and so, and that may have the consequence of limiting the total number that you could fit in the city because of that rule, but the intent, the reason for having it would be not to have a cluster. And that's one way to kind of obliquely get at the total concentration across the city as well.
Yeah, that could be a deleterious impact on the community in a conditional use permit, right?
Well, that's true. You could take it on a case-by-case basis when some applicant comes up, but if you build it into the ordinance, that just like there's a distance from a school, there's a minimum distance from an existing gun store, could be a provision that could be useful.
Yeah, what I'm struggling with is, and I think you mentioned this at the last meeting, is that we could go crazy with regulating every little piece of this and we might not accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, and trying to find a simpler way to ensure gun safety without putting so many. I mean, I have about 15 things here that I would want to see included in a model ordinance or zoning that, you know, we'll be here for the next 2 weeks every night trying to hash out, right? So I'm hoping I'm looking for a way to do it more simply, and I don't necessarily know what that is, but that's my goal, because otherwise I think we're going to over-regulate and not end up with the goal that we want. That's my concern.
I mean, we are bouncing around a little bit. I guess I would just put it out there. We're making a recommendation, and this will get further studied. I think we have heard from our community that they don't want additional gun stores in town. I would support just saying San Carlos maximum of 2 gun stores. I would support that. That might not be tested legal ground, and the city can make a further study and decision around that, but I would be comfortable recommending that from where we're at. And with that limitation, I wouldn't feel a need for a whole bunch of, radiuses and boxing it all in. Just a commercial district, not in our downtown or downtown core, and only 2 in town. I think that would be a pretty fair and reasonable place to put us, in my opinion.
And would you add to that, if one went out and another one wanted to replace it, it was subject to a CUP?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And then, I don't know what, I'm going to get the terminology wrong, but these operational rules in addition, like, it's got to comply with Shannon's list, right?
Yeah, 2 in town. If one leaves, someone else would have to apply through the full process, yeah.
Right, so even if we had a numerical limit, it seems like we'd still want the land use, all the other rules, because shop number 2 might have a very valuable permit on their hands that they could then sell to somebody who wants to build a less desirable store.
I think we should go through these details, and I support many of them, but I also think, as opposed to defining something that's just so burdensome no one else will try it, that's what I don't like as government goes. So if we only want 2 in town, let's say we only want 2 in town.
Would a limit of 2 be part of the zoning ordinance, or would that be, where would that, if as a city we decided to have only 2, where would that live?
Just through the chair, I think we'll have to figure that out if that's what ultimately makes its way into the ordinance, because remember, we're in a study session tonight. And I just want to remind you that the use permit process is like there's a due process land right that goes with the property when you have a use permit. So what I heard the commission talking about is you have to go through the whole process. A new entrant who was at the same location as an existing business, new owner at the same location would have the vested land use right at that location. They just need to get the law enforcement discretionary permit. But if that business closed and another business opened at a different location and they're still within the 2, then the whole process they'd have to go through that whole process. But just there's a land use right to continue to operate, and the code says, I think, 6 months. If it ceases for 6 months, it's deemed abandoned. But generally, it doesn't work that way. Usually, somebody comes in within the 6 months, but not always.
Thanks for the reminder. If it's a handover, no CUP applies.
So I agree with Commissioner Dugan that we don't want to have such onerous regulations that it's clear in our minds and others that the real intent is to ban gun sales. I think if we can legitimately tie back whatever we propose to logical gun safety considerations, then we're on solid ground, and that will set a fairly high bar, and it may be that a new retailer would decide to go elsewhere, but so long as we can tie it back to bona fide gun safety considerations, and it's not just, in my mind, it's not just to make me feel honest, but also to keep the law less vulnerable to being challenged, because its underlying intent is really other than gun safety, as gun safety as it with respect to sale of the gun. I mean, the gun safety in general is a broader question.
Wouldn't we be on safer legal ground, though, if we did it by location or distance from these certain other land uses rather than limiting the number of gun shops in the town to 2? Thank you, Peter.
You'd be on more known legal ground, because we know from the Ninth Circuit that distancing requirements are valid. What we don't know is whether limiting the number is, but that doesn't mean that it's invalid. It's just you're writing on a clean slate that way. Yep.
Thank you.
Would the fellow commissioners, whatever we determined otherwise, we could also have the cap as, our statement on, 2 is enough for San Carlos.
Yeah, one of the things I think we've heard from residents is an opportunity to show a little leadership, and listening to our residents, this is an opportunity, and I'd support that.
I would also.
I'm just remember, this is just the beginning of the process, so there's a lot of details that you're going to have to look at, and you know, you're not really voting on anything tonight. You're just considering things that you want to look at a future meeting.
Well, when could we, so we're not actually we're just making recommendations, but we will come together on what we feel the recommendations are.
You're not actually even making recommendations. You're just asking, at a study session, you're just asking us to bring an ordinance that has these concepts in it that you will then consider at a future meeting. And that's kind of the way we've teed it up. So we're really looking to you. So these are very helpful things that we want to look at, but we'll analyze those, and then staff's going to have a recommendation, of course. So I just want to make sure that you understand kind of where we are in the process. It's not that you're voting on a particular ordinance tonight. You're giving us guidance to bring something back to you.
Okay, so you guys have been tallying along the way. Okay, so we brought up a lot of
it
things.
sounded like we have some consensus on a cap on 2 in addition to whatever else we talk about tonight.
I think that it could fall under Planning Commission jurisdiction to have an overall limit of 2, just like a city might decide they don't want to become a strip mall of fast food restaurants because you're overdoing a certain type of establishment. And so I wouldn't, so I'm thinking about it. I'm having a limit of 2 because it changes the retail nature of the city. It seems like that's something that should be our prerogative. I was grappling with whether if you're trying to have a broader gun control system, that's a little out of our purview and should be in the hands of the elected representatives. But after, it seems like it's legitimate to also limit the number from a planning commission and zoning perspective. So I would like that, so long as it's hand in hand with the additional rules for how those limited number of 2 are allowed to establish their business.
And staff, would we be able to pull up our zoning map?
Is that the one you want?
Yeah, I mean, that's, zoomed into downtown, but you guys know it well enough, I would imagine. You can see the dark purple is downtown core, and the light purple is downtown, and the orange and the yellow, those are all residential. So as I look at it, I almost think it would be easy enough to recommend limiting it to commercial districts that aren't downtown or downtown core. Now that would allow it along the southern part of Laurel on one side of it. It looks, well, maybe that's mixed use. I don't know if that's, it must be commercial because there's plenty of commercial.
El Camino, the El Camino side?
Yeah, I mean, we have El Camino there, MUSB, and that's the same as the eastern side of Laurel. It's the same zoning on that end of town. And then it would also potentially open up commercial districts over by industrial, which, caused concern. People were pointing out there's a lot of youth-oriented businesses over in some of those industrial core. But if we were recommending a cap of 2, it just seems to me leaving it open to commercial districts that aren't in our downtown core part. I don't know, that strikes me as a way to get at it without coming up with a whole different overlay or something, more inventive.
And through the chair, if I may, I just wanted to clarify to the commission that the mixed-use districts that you have noted that are certainly along Laurel, and then all of the mixed-use districts along El Camino Real do allow residential. It doesn't mean that they're required to have. You can do a retail and office above, but there is a possibility that, there could be residential above, ground floor retail space. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Understood. And I don't, I kind of think when someone lives downtown, I don't, if there was apartments over Imbert and Smithers, I'm not sure that is a problem. I don't know.
I think we'd hear some comments if a gun store opened up next door to somebody's residence. I mean, that's...
oh, yeah.
That seems like dangerous.
It's
Some
kind of part and parcel
I
with
personally would want
mixed
some.
use, but, yeah.
Maybe it doesn't. We don't need to dial the up to the 1,000 foot, but maybe as a safety, even combining the approach you're suggesting, using the existing zoning categories plus a residential distance parameter.
Well, the only rub there is, we're putting, our whole downtown core is mixed use, I guess. What is pure commercial? That's just out by industrial, right? That's our only area of pure commercial, I believe.
Right, the GCI zoning district would be, yeah.
So we're actually putting it, then we're saying it can't be on El Camino if we go down that path.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's got to be on El Camino almost.
Yeah, El Camino's a tough one from the
and maybe
residential distance perspective.
But the thing that I'd like to stay away from is, in that area where there's the Office Depot, there's big retail and there's big buildings there. What I really would like to not have happen is you have a big building like the sporting goods store that sells weapons, right? And then you have this big for sale sign that's like big white with red letters and just sort of like is this big broadcast to come in there and buy a gun. That's like my biggest fear, is that we have some, and there's commercial use there, there's retail use there. That's one of the things that sticks out in my mind.
And people had a lot of concern about it down by industrial. Do we want to just say an overlay, El Camino, north of Holly and south of Britain? And again, I realize we're just recommending here, but just trying to get
let staff come up with some ideas.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
But I think that, you understand what we're going for there. You guys can parse up the map and make some recommendations.
And is that, do we kind of have a consensus that we do think El Camino away from our downtown core is what we're thinking about, and we're not thinking about big box type commercial districts?
I agree. It'd be nice not to have the big box area just because that's so so much exposure.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that we wanted. And then there are more than retail there. There's the sports, dance establishments and stuff there. So.
And those areas are quite dark in the middle of the night, and they're not well traveled either.
It almost gets too the offbeat parameter is another one that's hard, and we're sort of it's just asking for almost conflicting criteria here. But the map that the staff provided us with both the blue and the green areas for 600 and 1,000 foot. So if you're only at the 600 foot distance, almost meets the criteria you said of the south of Britain, north of Holly, with a few adjustments. But El Camino, that's going to be close to residences.
Well, it might be close to residences, but I think you have to look at the whole picture, right? And the distance really is what we recommend to City Council. I think staff gave us a good, idea of what it looked like, but the distances are arbitrary. Well, according to, I guess it does come to our.
I think we're sort of saying we want to be prescriptive and we don't want to think about radiuses from things. I mean, just because we don't want to put it in a dark corner of our industrial district.
Yeah, I agree with downtown core and what you were just saying. Municipal downtown core and
Maybe one of the things that would help would be if we were to select a couple of corridors and then ask staff to, if we could pinpoint any establishments that catered to youth activity or if where the nearest, just reminder, where the nearest schools and churches, synagogues were in those areas. It'll just remind us that actually we've, if we carve it in a certain way, we are not close. We may not be within, 600 feet. We may be within 600 feet, but we're not close. So a visual on might just be useful if you could do that. Highlight on the map. If you were to pick Camino, if you were to pick Britain, would we be encroaching on any schools? Where are the nearest schools? Where are the nearest places of worship, as two examples? And just pinpoint them, then we can see.
Or given that those might change over time as well, I mean, perhaps we add can we have a new condition to our conditional use permit criteria that just states these types of businesses, will not be in close proximity to sensitive establishments?
Well, once the use permit's approved, then it can't be modified with new businesses moving in. But there could be,
Right.
You're right, you don't have to establish a map necessarily. You could have each new business come in and run a map that they're not within a certain distance of a sensitive use. But I think to your question about where are they currently, if you look just above the lower G there where Redwood City is, there's a high school in Redwood City on Old County Road. And then when you come up, you see the P in gray. Those are where the schools are, the public schools in San Carlos. And you see the green with the PK is where the parks are. And so you see the light, I don't know, yellowish, or where the single-family residential neighborhood. So I think I checked in with staff, and we've gotten a lot of really good direction at this point from the commission as far as where you would like to see potential new businesses locate if they were to. Also, I understand you'd like to require a conditional use permit. You'd like to require the law enforcement permit. And so those are kind of the key areas we're looking for check-in on. So I think staff does feel like we have some pretty good direction at this point that we could move to City Council, get a little more conversation with them, and then come back to you.
Yeah, and some safety, some building safety or.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That would probably fall into the law enforcement permit as recommended by the police chief. Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to see a variety of the locational requirement strategies so that that us as commissioners and the city council and the public can kind of have some specific examples to weigh their sentiment against. So not just to come up with the one best, but to kind of scope out territory, and that'll be a good tool to get feedback on.
I like that idea, and I think we're at a point in time where I'd like to let the staff work on the next proposal so we can move forward. We've gotten some good input, not just from the Planning Commission, but our consultants and the Chief of Police and our residents in the community. So it's 9 o'clock. Maybe it's time we can take this home and think about it for the next couple of weeks and come to more final at that point, unless anyone else wants to speak.
I agree.
And we don't have to make a motion now.
And I'm sorry, we will study this again, or whatever you guys take from this will get studied by the city council and then
Correct.
brought back to us after that process.
Right, so we're going to take your input, bring it to the city council at their January 14th meeting, this is currently scheduled, and then come back to you with hopefully an ordinance based on direction from city council.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So that concludes our study session. Now, moving ahead with reports. Correspondence.
Chair Bradley, staff doesn't have any news for you on recent city council actions for you this evening.
And Planning Commission comments or reports? I have none.
Just like to wish staff and residents a very happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, thank you. Same to you.
I second that.
I guess we're ready to adjourn. Thank you all for coming and for your input, and we appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Through the chair, I did have a couple of administrative items. I'm sorry. I think
that's my fault.
It might have been my fault too. We're even. So as far as staff comments for the commission this evening, we do not have any planning projects ready to be presented to the commission on December 3rd. And I know there are at least 2 commissioners out that evening anyway, so we're going to go ahead and cancel the December 3rd Planning Commission meeting. However, it's
disappointing.
It is very likely. You'll have your first break, I think. There is a high possibility that we'll have a new mixed-use project, which is located at 560 Elm Street, ready. El Camino. Thank you. El Camino Real, 560 El Camino Real, ready to be presented to the commission on the 17th. So please do keep me posted. Just a friendly reminder, I know we're in the holiday season and, you know, there's things going on. So if there are any anticipated absences, just feel free to send me an email and let me know. But otherwise, we are ready to have a meeting on the 17th, provided we have a quorum and we have projects. And then after that, we'll have a break, and our first meeting in January will be on the 7th. And that is all I have for you this evening. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Meeting is adjourned.